We are going to get started now. So good afternoon, good morning if you're joining from the West Coast, and good evening to those of you in Europe and in Israel. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, the sponsor of this talk, which is also co-sponsored by the History PhD program at the Graduate Center. I want to thank you all for coming to this presentation of Derek Penslar's new book, Zionism, An Emotional State, which I have here. This is a new history of Zionism that examines the emotions that have shaped Zionist sensibilities and practices over the course of the movement's history. The book came out over the summer with Rutgers University Press, and we had planned this event in a very different world. Professor Penslar in the international community, which is drawn from the 5th chapter of the book. However, in light of the Hamas attacks of October 7th and the resurgence of virulent anti-Zionism in this country and abroad, along with an exponential jump in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, I asked Professor Penslar if he would be willing to talk about the last chapter in his book, which covers a particularly urgent topic. The chapter is entitled Hating Zionism and focuses on hatred of Zionism and its overlaps with anti-Semitism, as well as hatred in the name of Zionism. Hence the title of his talk today, Zionism as Hated Object and Hating Subject. This is a poignant and timely theme, and indeed one bound to generate strong emotions, as Zionism, an emotional state, skillfully demonstrates. Now, as you can see, this talk is being recorded, will later be uploaded to the YouTube channel of the GC Center for Jewish Studies. Your microphones are currently muted, and I'd like to invite you all to keep them muted throughout the program. After the talk, there will be some time for questions. Now, this is a very large Zoom meeting, so we are not going to ask people to unmute themselves to ask their questions. Instead, please type out your questions in the chat box, and I will make sure to read them out loud for you as time allows. And now it's finally time to introduce our speaker. Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University, where he also directs Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies. Penslar's research focuses on transnational Jewish history in modern times within the context of nationalism, capitalism, and colonialism. He has held research fellowships in Germany, Israel, the United Kingdom, as well as the US. And before moving to Harvard, he taught at Indiana University Bloomington, the University of Toronto, and the University of Oxford, where he was the first Stanley Lewis Chair in Israel Studies. Professor Penslar is the author of numerous groundbreaking books, including Zionism and Technocracy, the Engineering of the Jewish Settlement in Palestine, 1870-1918, Shylock's Children, Economics and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe, Jews and the Military, A History, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, and most recently, Zionism, An Emotional State. He has co-edited multiple collections, and he's currently writing a book about worldwide reactions to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Thank you so much, Derek, for agreeing to give this talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right, Francesca? Great. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Zoom is to an in-person talk what instant coffee is to ground roast, but we'll do the best we can. And I recognize a lot of familiar names and faces of the people who are here, so it's nice to see you all. So yes, as Francesca said, this talk represents, on one hand, it is taken from the final chapter of my new book, but I also integrate the talk into some themes that run through the book as a whole. And I've also updated the talk to take into account the events, the tragic events of the last month or so. So I want to start by talking about why I would even think about writing a history of Zionism that is classified according to emotion as opposed to the more conventional understandings, which would be through high politics. Most histories of Zionism are either about high politics or they're about Zionist thought. You think about the first major historiographical contributions on Zionism in English, it was Arthur Hertzberg's the Zionist idea. So Zionism understood mainly as through the lens of intellectual history. But Zionism has to be understood as many different things. It is an ideology. It is a systemic or systematic belief system. It's also a social movement, or at least it was a social movement until 1948. But even after the State of Israel was founded, Zionism continued. And the reason why Zionism continued even after the state existed is because Zionism was perhaps first and foremost, and still is, an affective bundle. That is, it's a bundle of emotions, like various forms of political emotion, of feeling that that your well-being is connected with a collective of some kind. It could be a national community or a social community, but all of these senses of a political emotion are valid as much for Zionism as for really any form of any national movement in the modern world. Now, I use the term emotions a lot in this talk and in the book. What do I even mean by emotions? As some of you may know, emotions history has become a really interesting, flourishing subfield of history over the last half century in general, but over the past 20 years or so in particular, with some very important work done in the early 21st century. But I can define emotion largely in terms of how the medievals, or how even St. Augustine defined emotion in terms of motions of the soul, whether they are towards or moving away from the fulfillment of desire. So when you think about it, there are negative emotions that have to do with the feeling that whatever it is you desire is either not going to be attained or it's going to be taken from you. So these are various feelings of fear, trepidation, anger, hatred, and so forth, resentment. And then positive emotions have something to do with the attainment of desire, anticipation, joy, happiness, contentment when you've obtained the object of desire. And that is obviously a schematic, but I think it's a very helpful one, that if we think of emotions as reflecting the salience and the nature of desire, and that's the sense in which I use the term today. Now, since this talk is about hatred, it's largely about negative emotions. And negative emotions, again, which have something to do with the lack of fulfillment or the anticipation of fulfillment of desire. Negative emotions, like positive emotions, can vary quite broadly. They can be petty feelings of envy, disquiet. There's a marvelous book on affect theory by Sha Nai called Ugly Feelings, about these, what she calls representations of obstructed agency, just something you want to get done that you can't get done, and it generates negative feelings. But I'm going to be focusing today more on, I would say, the more spectacular negative emotions of anger and hatred. Now, anger and hatred are related. They're interrelated emotions, but they're not exactly the same. And I'll talk a lot about anger and hatred over the next 40 minutes. Just to briefly sketch it out, according to the sociologist Aaron Halperin, anger is focused on the action of a target object, and fear on the consequence of events. What does that mean? Well, you're angry at someone or something. You're angry at someone when someone has done something which deprives you of a need or a desire. So you're angry at them. You're expressing a lack of that someone has deprived you of something that you want. Fear will be then the consequence of events. You are afraid lest something terrible happen to you. Hatred is much deeper. Hatred is exclusively focused on the object itself. So you're not just angry at a person because of a certain incident that happened. You hate that person. You see the difference between the situational aspect of anger and the much more hardened feeling of hatred. Now, one thing that's really interesting is the connection between hatred and love, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit again in this talk. This goes back to Catullus 85. I'll just play briefly from Johann Johansson, who's his beautiful rendition of Odi et Amo.
I'm not sure if the audio is coming through.
Oh, the audio is Oh, no. Well, it's odiat amo, and I hate and I love. This is one of Catullus's most famous sayings. Why I say this, perhaps you ask, I know not, but I feel it happening and I am tortured. That is, there's an ancient understanding of the connection between love and hatred. And it's something that even the Zionist activist, writer, journalist, publicist, and leader Nachum Sokolov understood in a beautiful and rather not very often read book that he published in the early 30s, shortly before his death, called Chibat Zion. He wrote that hatred has a subtle relation with love. We hate only those with whom we possess affinity. Human hatred is a passion for physical and spiritual adjustments, which, not knowing how to fulfill itself in love towards its own kind, tries to break through to success by means of assault or war. That is, he understands that to hate something involves a passion, a passionate connection with it, a desire that has not been fulfilled and has been blocked, and that generates then a tremendous negative feeling. We're going to see how all of this plays out. So just to sort of summarize it, I would say that hatred is petrified anger. Because anger is something situational. Hatred becomes permanent and extremely hard to undo once it has been formed. And then when hatred releases itself in certain ways, and it becomes rage. And rage is actually a loss even of awareness. And that's why I call rage molten hatred. And I'm afraid that on October 7th, what we saw was an outburst of rage, which was a kind of melting of hatred. So that's the kind of emotional framework or methodological framework to the book as a whole, and particularly why I talk about hatred. I'm also interested in how political movements, religious movements, social movements often generate emotional waves. But there's something about Zionism in Israel that generates emotional tsunamis. And we can see this with what's going on now on university campuses throughout the United States. That is, there's a war going on. 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered. Now Israel is attacking Gaza. It's killed, we don't know exactly how many, but thousands of Palestinians have been killed. This is obviously something that will get a lot of people upset. But we all know that the global reaction to this war and to the deaths of these Jews and Palestinians has been very different from the global reaction to many other conflicts. And this is just interesting to try to understand why it is that Zionism has always, by the way, created an emotional tsunami. This is not the first time this has happened. So if we start with, let's say, positive emotions, why does Zionism in Israel evoke such strong positive emotions? Because there are many people in the world who are passionately pro-Zionist. They love Israel. Some of it is Christian fervor. I mean, after all, the scores of millions of evangelical Christians in the United States today profess a great love of Israel. And the fervor, which might be messianic, the notion that the Jews must settle in the state of Israel so that the second coming of Christ can occur, whether it's a genuine humanitarianism, the reasons vary. But Christian fervor is a very important source of positive emotions towards Zionism in Israel. Guilt for the past, Holocaust guilt, which certainly explains the official position, say, of the German government. Admiration for Israel's achievements. There are a lot of people in the world who are thrilled by the notion of what's it called, startup nation. And they see Israel as, particularly in the United States, as a kind of an extension of Western technology and know-how in a region which is often perceived, at least in the United States, perhaps less in other parts of the Western world, as backward. There's also personal contact. I mean, a lot of people in the world, particularly in the United States and Canada, have Jewish friends, Jewish neighbors, Israelis living down the street. And the personal contact should not be neglected. And we should also not neglect the force of Islamophobia. That is, people who have negative feelings about Muslims or about the Arab world, then might translate that into positive feelings about Israel. But then why would Zionism in Israel evoke such strong negative emotional reactions, which is really what we're talking about today? Well, once again, Christian fervor, because although there are some Christians who approach Zionism from a position of sympathy, there are many Christians whose interpretation of their Christian faith has led them since before 1948, and particularly since 1948, into a profound sympathy with the Palestinians, whom they identify with the suffering of Jesus. They see the Jews as the continuation of the stubborn and hateful Jews of the period of the New Testament who rejected Jesus. Muslim fervor, I think, is self-explanatory. That is, the presence of a Jewish state in the heart of the Arab and Muslim Middle East is something that Muslims throughout the world have found throughout the 20th century deeply offensive. And people care more when people with whom they have affinity get killed than people with whom they don't have affinity. And so the deaths of the Palestinians in Gaza, for example, obviously have a very strong effect on people who have strong Islamic attachments. In the Western world, it's a bit different. There's colonial guilt. There's guilt over the heritage of the Western powers in the subjugation of so much of Africa and Asia, and a sense that the Western world has actually enabled Israel over the decades and should stop. So there's a good deal of colonial guilt, but then throughout the developing world, as it used to be called, anti-colonial anger that might have nothing to do with being a Muslim. It might simply have to do with being a person in a part of the world that was colonized and feeling that Israel represents a continuation into the 21st century of that colonial mentality and heritage. Personal contacts are also not to be neglected. Personal contacts with Palestinians or Middle Easterners in general. And then only last, and I'm doing this on purpose, only last would be the possibility that people are cross with Israel or hateful of Israel because of animosity towards Jews. I saw that David Engel is on the call, and I just want to make a quick shout out to the marvelous new book on edited volume on anti-Semitism that Scott Urey and Guy Marone co-edited, that begins and ends with essays by David Engel about the problematic use of the term anti-Semitism, and I won't go into that here, except to say that I often encourage my students when talking about why Israel creates such strong negative feelings to try to come up with all sorts of answers and just not use the word anti-Semitism, not because anti-Semitism doesn't exist. There are people who have animosity towards Jews. They just assume that because someone's Jewish, this person has negative qualities. But there are other reasons why people in the world don't like Israel. And we have to try to balance them out. And I think that kind of corrective can be very helpful. So now we get to sort of the heart of things, which is to understand where feelings of hatred of Zionism in Israel come from. So the first idea would be that if someone is an anti-Semite, and I'm defining that term very carefully, as someone who views Jews as possessed as a collective of negative qualities and personality traits. And we all know there are certain anti-Semitic stereotypes about greed, avarice, manipulation, thirst for power. There are all kinds of even more dark and somber aspects about, for example, Nazi anti-Semitism with notions of Jewish sexual desire and power. But an anti-Semite I would define as somebody who has these negative perceptions of Jews. Does this actually lead to, or inexorably lead to, a dislike of animosity towards Zionism in Israel? Well, you saw a little bit of it in the early 20th century with the kind of anti-Semitic worldviews, perceptions of Zionism. So when Henry Ford published a kind of a serialized version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the Dearborn Independent, there were a couple of chapters in this 104, 106 chapter serial. There were a couple that specifically dealt with Zionism, and that dealt with Zionism as an example of Jews manipulating the British Empire, using their classic, the kind of dark powers that anti-Semites attribute to Jews, using their powers to manipulate the British Empire for their own interests, that the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate were all the result of British manipulation. And the real victim in this kind of anti-Semitic discourse is not the Palestinians themselves. That is, the Dearborn Independent had no interest in the Palestinian Arabs. The real victims are white people in the West who will suffer from the accumulation of Jewish power in a Jewish homeland. We see this idea already very early on in Eugen Döring, in his vicious anti-Semitic tract from 1892, in which he wrote that Zionism is simply impossible. That is, the Jews, even if they were to unite in a territory, could not renew themselves, what he called their obtrusive nomadism. In other words, they have to be nomads because if they were to form their own community, they would simply, as he says, eat each other alive because they'd have no one else to exploit. And such a thing as a Jewish state would mean the destruction of the Jews by the Jews. So Dering is saying Zionism is an impossibility, and even if Jews attempt a state, it will not only fail, they will all wind up eating each other because they have no one else to prey upon. Dering then went on to write in 1920, after the establishment of the British mandate over Palestine, that Zionism now represents a grave threat in which we need what he calls a second Roman clearing action, going back to the beginning and bringing the matter to an end in an entirely different and far more comprehensive sense. So this is classic eliminationist anti-Semitism. Zionism is a serious threat. Jews are a serious threat. Zionism is Jewish. Zionism is a threat, and it simply must be completely destroyed. Classically explained by Adolf Hitler, endowed with sovereign rights and removed from the intervention of other states, a Jewish state would become what Hitler called a haven for convicted scoundrels and a university for budding crooks. So again, in this classic anti-Semitic view, if you don't like Jews, you're definitely not going to like Zionism or Israel. In the International Jew that I referred to a moment ago, some of the more fanciful anti-Zionist material was not taken from the protocols of the elders of Zion. It was actually interpolated. It was added by a mild-mannered, alcoholic Canadian journalist from Windsor, Ontario, and I'm sorry to say a graduate of the University of Toronto, named William Cameron, who was a good friend of Henry Ford's, had lunch with him on a daily basis in the Ford in the Ford factory, and wrote these passages that dealt specifically with the manipulative powers of the Jews over British and world policy. This notion then of Zionism as something that emerges from allegations of traditional Jewish mendacity and supernal power survived well past 1948. Here we see the anti-Semitic depiction of a Jewish spider with the word Zionism written on it in its web of waiting for prey. Interestingly enough, in the United States after 1948, Jews were also considered to be manipulative, but not as opponents of Bolshevism, but rather as Bolsheviks, which was fundamental to the writings of Robert Welch, founder of the John Birch Society. And we see this all the time in the so-called Journal of Historical Review, which is a rag of Holocaust denial and other right-wing ideals that presents Jews, and including Zionism in Israel, as a natural and ongoing source of the Bolshevik virus. Something really interesting began to happen in the early 21st century, where the term Zio, not Zionist, which was used as a pejorative for a long time, but the word Zio became a pejorative prefix in American and then in global discourse, largely on the internet. I believe it was pioneered by David Duke, anti-Semite and racist, who had been Ku Klux Klan leader and was a member of the Louisiana state parliament. David Duke spoke a lot about Zio-Nazis, that is, Israelis are Zio-Nazis. And the term Zio got picked up by all kinds of people who don't like Israel and don't like other groups. So misogynist right-wingers talk about Zio-feminists. Zio-eco-terrorists, I've seen that one. Basically you don't like something, you put the prefix Zio in front of it. So this is kind of a continuation of the notion that it's Jewish, it's Zionist, it's therefore evil. On the other hand, there are anti-Semites in the world in the last 20 years in particular who admire Israel a great deal. Here we have Benjamin Netanyahu, the very long, perhaps I would say definitely too long, serving of Israel, Prime Minister of Israel, with Viktor Orban of Hungary, who has claimed, as have many Hungarians, great admiration for Israel. Years ago, I gave talks in Hungary and was approached by members of the Jobbik party, at that time a right-wing anti-Semitic party, who claimed to me that they had great admiration for Israel because they described it as a fortress state surrounded by enemies. And they found Israel a kind of model of an ethno-nationalist state, as certain right-wing Americans, far right-wing Americans have said as well. But there's a complicated relationship between anti-Semitism, so-called love of Israel, and hatred. So Mike Evans, an evangelical Christian, made a very interesting claim in June of 2021 that I think really sums up the relationship between odi et amo, or love and hate. This is when he was furious at Israelis for being critical of the Netanyahu government. And this is June of 21, so this is even before the November 2022 elections. But he talks about how if Israelis and Jews the world over keep up this, interestingly enough, pathetic political striptease act, this is how he describes criticism of Netanyahu, I'll spend the rest of my life fighting them all. Now I understand how the Holocaust happened. German Jews were busy insulting each other, drunk on the wine of pride. They did not see the smoke of Auschwitz rising because they were more German than they were Jews. This gets really interesting. He loves this term striptease actors, which is fascinating. Anyway, the Jews are screaming at the top of their lungs, crucify him, crucify him. It is sick and shameful to see such a group running like rabid dogs, possessed with power and revenge. What appreciation do you show us? You shit right on our face. How dare you? Let's see if that works. Yeah. So this is very much odi et amo. And if any of you have seen the film, I think it's called Till Kingdom Come. It's a film about evangelical Christian support for Israel, where I guess one of these evangelical preachers who's interviewed is caught off guard and starts saying some not so complimentary things about the very Jews who he had been praising moments earlier in public because of their creation of the state of Israel. So that's one way of looking at the issue then, is that anti-Semitism can yield or produce anti-Zionism. The other, which is more controversial, is if people are angry at or hate Zionism or Israel, does this mean automatically that they hate Jews? This is probably the key political question now in the Jewish world today. A very common idea expressed by many people in the Jewish world that when people express pro-Palestinian feelings, solidarity with the Palestinians, support for what they call their struggle for freedom in Palestine, when they support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel and so forth, so that there's something fundamentally hateful about these. Here we see the American Jewish Committee statement on the boycott movement. It's simply absurd to ask if BDS is anti-Semitic, because calling for the dismantling of the world's only Jewish state, must be anti-Semitic. We can see in the wake of the now quite quaint Ben & Jerry's controversy of a couple of years ago, the fact that Ben & Jerry's didn't want to sell ice cream on the West Bank was seen as an anti-Semitic slur that led this enterprising person to come up with fake Ben & Jerry flavors like anti-Sement with BS in it and Judenrein. So, and then of course, since October 7th of 2023, the sense that Palestinian expressions of desires for liberation, freedom, like the phrase from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, are ipso facto expressions of hatred. And they're expressions of hatred of Israel. And then, ergo, they must be also expressions of hatred for Jews. We have to sort of unpack some of that, but this is what is quite common right now, these common views. And this has caused, again, before October 7th, there was a feeling among many American Jewish organizations that the universities in particular are hotbeds of an anti-Zionism, which is in fact an anti-Semitism. So here we see a call for Jews in America to give money to fight against the Harvard University newspaper's declaration a couple of years ago of support for the boycott movement. So stand up to anti-Semitism. And this has now strengthened and multiplied enormously since October 7th. So here we see Columbia University, which has been the site of a lot of very contentious demonstrations, pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So here we now have a Jewish pro-Israel counter-demonstration. So the idea again being asserting Palestinian demands is ipso facto hating Israel, and hating Israel is ipso facto hating Jews. So we need to unpack this a little bit. One is, what's the difference between anger and hate? Are they the same thing? And I said earlier, they're not. Anger and hatred are not the same thing. I mean, as I often say when I teach my undergrads, I assume you all get angry at your parents sometimes. Anger is fleeting. You want something, you can't get it, you get angry. And there are a lot of people who I would say it would be very surprising if they weren't angry at Israel. I mean, you think about if you're a Palestinian and what happened to your family in 1948 and what has happened to everything from Israeli citizens of the state of Israel living under military rule in the 1950s to then the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, the nature of the occupation, the limitations on movement, the violence, the oppression, and so forth. It would be unusual, I think, for people living in that environment not to be angry at the people who are engaging in these actions. And the anger, we could see how it could petrify into hate. That is, where you're not just angry on a situational level, but if it happens over and over again for a long period of time, the anger certainly can mutate into hatred. And once it's become hatred, it's very hard to undo it. So in other words, although hatred is fundamentally destructive, hatred can have a rational origin. The problem is that even if hatred has a rational origin, if it leads to hateful actions like killing people, abusing people, harming people, it's destructive. So I'm not justifying or I'm not excusing hatred. I want to make sure people understand that. I'm just saying that anger is situational. Hatred becomes much more enduring and permanent. But there are understandable reasons why anger develops and why hatred develops out of anger. And in the case of Palestine, it's not surprising that these emotions have developed any more than Jewish feelings that I'll talk about in a little bit have developed the way they have. The question is whether it is anti-Semitic to have these feelings of, if not just anger, but actually hatred. Well, I don't think anybody on this call would call Moshe Dayan the decorated war hero of the state of Israel, former chief of the general staff, former defense secretary. Nobody would call him an anti-Semite. But here he is in 1956 giving a eulogy for a young man who moved to a Gaza border kibbutz and was murdered by Arabs. And Dayan gave a celebrated funeral for this young man, Roy Ortberg, in which he says, "Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years they've sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt." He's saying they hate us, and they hate us for understandable reasons. And then his response is that Israel must be ready to defend itself because these people hate us. But I don't think anyone has accused Dayan of being an anti-Semite because he was explaining Palestinian hatred through a rational lens. I should say, by the way, that this particular part of the eulogy, which is the first paragraph of the eulogy, has actually been removed from many of the versions of the eulogy that you find on the internet. But you can go back and you can find an original version which has this. And also, by the way, when a recording was made of it, after the actual event, Dayan re-recorded it in the Kol Yisrael studios. They left out this part, but it is part of the original eulogy. So hatred, then, as petrified anger, can have a rational origin, but it can also be irrational. Clearly, it can come from a selectivity which is downright malicious. So, for example, there's a phrase that I've heard over and over again in the last 20 years, and you can see from this engram how there's a spike around the year 2000 to the phrase "Israel's right to exist." This is a very strange phrase. I don't know of any other state in the world, no matter how contentious, no matter how disputed, where people question its so-called right to exist. And it's interesting also how the discourse, you see how it really picks up right after the beginning of the Second Intifada, a little bit during the 1980s and 90s, so the first Intifada, but much more during the second. And if you look up the phrase "Israel's right to exist" in various dictionaries, you'll find that, or the phrase "right to exist," it only is associated with Israel. So Existenzrecht, for example, in German, Israel's right to exist, as opposed to, I don't know, Hungary's right to exist or some other country's right to exist. The term, by the way, right to exist, first appeared in early interwar literature about the creation of new states in Central Europe. But now it only refers to Israel. There's something very strange going on here, right? This is not just, I think, rational. There's something irrational going on here. And this then leads us to the attempts to somehow understand the difference between what one might call acceptable or unacceptable criticism of Israel, and to what extent these definitions of anti-Semitism that have been created in recent years try to delegitimize the right of people to be angry. Again, I've said that it's quite understandable why a Palestinian or people who are very sympathetic with Palestinians might be quite angry or even hate Israel. But if you look at this definition, that's very popular now, and many Jewish organizations have urged governments and corporations and sports teams and universities to adopt a certain definition of anti-Semitism, which is often associated with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's often called the IRA definition. IRA did not write it. It was written by a European Union group in 2004. And it's called a working definition, meaning subject to change, but people treat it today with a kind of totemic status. And one of the things it defines as anti-Semitism is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And then it says below, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, that this is not just anti-Israel, but it's anti-Semitic. And that interests me because I live in both Canada and the United States. The United States is routinely accused by indigenous activists of genocide. And African Americans, have and people who sympathize with Black America's struggle for civil rights often call the United States a racist country. Canada is often referred to by indigenous activists as racist. So then you can call Israel racist. I mean, these are democratic countries. So there's very strange conflation here of things that are clearly anti-Semitic, like using anti-Semitic imagery of Jews as Shylocks or as killers of children or something, the medieval idea that Jews ritually kill children and drink their blood. Obviously, that's anti-Semitic. But this definition also includes all kinds of forms of political speech that really would be completely valid in many other parts of the world. So anyway, that's then about this whole question of Zionism itself. Does it or does it not, or does anti-Zionism automatically lead to anti-Semitism? I think the answer is no. I'm just going to finish up now by talking about the fact that Zionism itself can be hateful. And evidently somebody who read something about what I wrote was very angry at me and hated me for even saying this. So they kind of proved my point. Of course, Zionism can hate. All national movements can hate. We're human beings. Everybody's capable of hatred. Now, it's true that in the anti-Semitic atmosphere of the early 20th century, the poet Chaim Nachman Bialik actually said that there is no revenge possible after a pogrom. He wrote this poem in front of you after the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, in which he says, "Vengeance for the blood of a child Satan has yet to devise." But it was quite common after the war for understandable reasons for Jews to express hatred of Germans, hatred of Europeans in general. So this poem by the great poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg, "We were not likened to dogs among the Gentiles." The Gentiles did not handle their sheep as they handled our bodies. Before the slaughter, they did not pull out the teeth of their sheep. They did not push the sheep into the fire to make ash of the living and to scatter the ashes over streams and sewers. This is a man consumed with hatred for the Gentile world that destroyed 2/3 of European Jewry. A master of political hatred after World War II was the ghetto uprising leader and Zionist activist Abba Kovner, who actually wrote military manuals for the IDF in 1948 that were immersed in hatred, so much so that actually a lot of other people in the IDF a command structure had to sort of modify them or tone them down because they did not want a soldiery that was motivated primarily by hatred. But Kovner translated his hatred of Germans to a hatred of Arabs, and it's very clear in his wartime writings. So, in other words, political hatred certainly could exist and did. Ironically, transcending hatred was also possible, even for the Zionist right. Here we see on the eve of World War II, the revisionist Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky imagined a Jewish state in which there would be complete equality between Jews and Arabs. And in fact, if the prime minister is a Jew, then the vice premiership would have to be given to an Arab and so forth, and vice versa, meaning there could be an Arab prime minister. In other words, he had a vision of complete equality between Jews and Arabs and no hatred at all. And I mention this because Jabotinsky is often associated with an essay he wrote in 1923 called The Iron Wall, in which he talks about the need to convince Arabs through military force that Israel, or a future Jewish state, cannot be defeated. But there's no hatred. It's very different, though, when we get to Jabotinsky's alleged successor, who in fact differed from Jabotinsky in many ways, and that was Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin hated. He openly hated, and he celebrated hatred. There's a classic underground fighter's mentality that hatred is ennobling. It is a way to empower an oppressed and abused people. As he writes, we have to hate. And, we have to hate the situation of the Jewish people. We have to hate, in other words, hate is something existential. We have to hate our condition. But then we have to hate those who are oppressing us. We have to hate them. If you love freedom, you must hate slavery. If you love your people, you cannot but hate the enemies that compass their destruction. You cannot but hate those who seek to annex your country. In other words, so you hate your enemy. And for him, hatred is ennobling. He doesn't run away from hatred or try to avoid it. And then how does that hatred, which Begin so extolled, how and when does it lead to rage? That is just the loss of complete self-control and mass killing. There's actually scholars who work on the emotional bases of rage going back to the Middle Ages. A great article on this in a book by Barbara Rosenwein. And Hillel Cohen's book on the 1929 riots is also very good at showing how anger and hatred under the right conditions explode and turn into murderous rage. But after the state of Israel was created, there was no room in it. There was no room in its political culture for any kind of publicly acknowledged hatred. I'm not saying that Jews didn't hate Arabs in their private lives. I'm saying that the public discourse in the state of Israel of the 1950s was not hatred, not rage, but from official comity. We see a picture here of the Nazareth mayor, Armin Gagura, with the short-lived prime minister, or the short-serving prime minister, Moshe Sharet. The official line is that Arabs are it's just the Arab minority in the state of Israel, that they are citizens of the state of Israel, that despite military rule, they have a place in the state of Israel. This is very similar to the post-World War II political culture of Yugoslavia, which tried to overcome the long-standing hatreds between Serbs and Croats and between Serbs and Bosnian Muslims under the slogan brotherhood and unity. Now, under the surface, there may have been a lot of hatred, but above this, on the surface, brotherhood and unity. So Israel also claimed that it's a country of citizens, Arab citizens as well as Jewish citizens. But then what do you do if you're going to posit a political realm without hatred? What do you do then about a war, a genocide, a great act of violence that just came before? So as the Turkish scholar Fatma Gütçek has written about Turkey and Armenia, that in order to have a notion of comity, you have to deny hatred, you have to deny violence. And again, the Turkish government until, well, I guess it was about 2009 when it began to change, was working very, very hard to deny the realities of the Armenian genocide. And just to sum it up in one sentence, the idea about so much of the denial of hatred is, in the case of, let's say, a genocide or a mass killing or a mass expulsion, it didn't happen. It wasn't that bad. They started it. and it wasn't our fault. And when you think about it, a lot of the literature in Israel, the political discourse in Israel, from the late 40s until very recently, has been about what Palestinians call the Nakba, the mass expulsions, and the mass flight from Israel in 1948. A lot of the Israeli responses have been, it didn't happen. There was no Nakba. They fled of their own and so on. It wasn't that bad. That is, the Palestinians say 800,000 or 750,000. We say 500,000. They started it. Well, if it did happen, it was the Palestinians. They started, and it wasn't our fault. So that actually explains Nakba denial, which can conceal a hatred, but it doesn't acknowledge it. That's what makes what's happening now in Israel so new, is that in the wake of the Hamas massacre of October 7th, we now have language where the Nakba is being invoked publicly for the first time by right-wing Israeli politicians, like Avi Dichter saying, we are rolling out Nakba 2023. Another minister says, we're going to have a second Nakba. So it's interesting. It's like saying that the Nakba didn't happen, but now we're going to repeat it. And this is new in political discourse in Israel, to acknowledge the Nakba only to praise a reoccurrence of it in forcing Palestinians out of Gaza. But until now, the official line in Israel has been a denial of Nakba because it's a denial of hatred. Again, Israel was not supposed to be, right, a country steeped in political hatred. There were always exceptions. There was Meir Kahane already in the 1970s, but even he denied hating. He said, I don't hate Arabs, I love Jews. Again, hatred in the post-World War II era very often masks itself in the form of love of one's own group, which forces you to defend yourself against another group. The shallowness of this argument, though, is clear in Kahane's own words, as here where he writes about the tendency of Arabs to engage in sexual crimes against Jewish women in order to attack and degrade the enemy. So now I know that the Hamas massacre did involve sexual crimes, which was a great tragedy and a great crime. But again, Kahane is writing this in 1980, and he's writing about this with no real evidence. And we are in a new political atmosphere then, where there's a kind of a legitimacy to hatred, which we saw previously in the like of someone like Baruch Goldstein, who killed dozens of Palestinians on Purim in 1994, in Hebron, right-wing activist Benny Gopstein, who works very hard to campaign against Jewish-Arab intermarriage, another figure, Baruch Marzel, Michael Ben-Ari, Itamar Ben-Gvir. All of these people represented a kind of new hard right in the 21st century that did not hide hatred, what I call hatred without shame, that is openly admitting hatred of Arabs. We see this in Itamar Ben-Gvir and also in the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich. This even penetrated into the highest realm of the government as far back as 2015, when on election day of 2015, where Benjamin Netanyahu put on Facebook, the Arab voters are moving in droves to the polling stations. With your help, we will form a national government that will protect the state of Israel, because the idea is that Arab citizens of the state are enemies of the state of Israel. And without going into all of the numbers, I've been looking at survey data from 1999 to 2021 that shows a substantial majority of the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, expresses animosity towards Arabs, citizens of the state, Palestinians in general, to the point of favoring their expulsion, favoring their disenfranchisement. I mean, there's study after study after study. And if anyone wants, I have all the numbers in my book, and I have footnotes that lead to all of the studies. There is a very strong correlation between religiosity and intolerance. It's not one-to-one, but the more Orthodox people are, the more likely they are to be intolerant. And Israeli Jewish hatred of Arabs and Arab hatred of Israelis is reciprocal. And it's definitely been present over the last 20 years. And what this leads to, and I'm coming towards the end, what this leads to is a state of Israel, a political culture in which Israeli Arabs are seen as hostile figures, and in which Israeli-Arab unrest is interpreted through the lens of a pogrom or of the Holocaust. So as in May of 2021, when there was a lot of unrest in the state of Israel, the mayor of Lod and the president of the country, Reuven Rivlin, made specific comparisons between Arab vandalism, Arab attacks on Jews, with pogroms in Russia or with the Holocaust. And this, again, has multiplied 1,000-fold in the wake of October 7th, when Hamas indulged in an orgy of hatred and rage and savagely killed 1,200 Israeli civilians. A lot of this is being interpreted now through the lens of the Holocaust. So here we have Prime Minister Netanyahu comparing Hamas to Amalek, the historic archenemy of the Jewish people, whom God commands in the Bible to completely eliminate, to destroy every last one. So again, hatred has become more publicly acceptable over the last 20 years, and now what's happened in the wake of the Hamas massacre, it represents an extension of that trend. I'm just going to finish with a question. Do diaspora Jews share or diverge from this Israeli Jewish consensus? In general, Jews in diaspora, particularly America, have expressed much more support for Palestinian statehood than within the state of Israel, that is. And I sense that although American Jews at the moment are extremely supportive of Israel in its desire to eradicate Hamas, there probably is a more moderate tone and perhaps more awareness and more concern about the Palestinians of Gaza. I don't have qualitative or quantitative evidence, but certainly qualitatively, my reading of the Israeli press, other than the left-wing press, but the general Israeli press, and comparing it, say, with the American Jewish press, you get differences. So the conclusion then is that hatred, as Menachem Begin described it, hatred of the enemy can create a certain kind of social solidarity. That is, if you hate the British, or in our own situation now where there's a lot of hatred of Palestinians, it does create a sense of social solidarity. Just as anti-Semitism can also create a sense of solidarity. People have a common enemy, and that can unite them. But hatred destroys the very society it seeks to protect. The hatred of Jews, extreme anti-Semitism, has been a symptom of social dysfunction, political dysfunction, and the states that have encouraged or fomented high levels of anti-Semitism, those regimes have collapsed. The hatred that Hamas has fomented will not lead to, I think, a good outcome for the Palestinian people and for the people of the state of Israel. Indulging in hatred damages them as well. So I don't think there's actually an upside to hatred. But with that, I'll stop. It's been 50 minutes, so I'll stop, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Derek. This is an illuminating talk, and I think we couldn't have asked for a better guide to these historical developments. We have some questions already, and some of these questions are coming only to me, but I think some are being posted to everyone. So let me start. I have questions on my own, but I'm going to refrain for now. But let me start with a question from Phil Keisman to you, who's asking, in light of your characterization of shifts in the emotionality of and about Zionism, do you see any role of changing media, of political communication in the changing tenor or these emotions? In other words, does the medium through which the emotional, does the medium, can you hear me now? Does the medium through which political communication happens impact the emotional component of the politics?
Absolutely. It absolutely does. And I think I don't think it's a coincidence that the diffusion and the, as it were, greater permissibility of hatred has directly been associated with the rise of social media, the internet in general and social media in particular. Now, you might say that the internet and social media also allow for the rapid transmission of positive emotions, hope, love, and so forth. The fact is, though, that in terms of their immediate power, negative emotions are always more powerful than positive ones. And just to give a concrete example, if you go on the internet and you look at comments below a political video, they're often quite unhinged. I mean, they're just hugely angry. If you go on YouTube and look at a music video and look at the comments, they're full of love and support. I've never seen a negative comment on a YouTube video by a musician. But the fact is, in the world of political discourse, as we know also from American politics, Israeli politics, negativity works much better than positivity. So social media has allowed for the immediate transmission of misinformation, disinformation, which has a it has a transformative effect on the human psyche. And it might very well be, that just as they say that London taxi drivers' brains actually change, their cortex actually changes when they learn the entire roadmap of London. It could very well be that exposure to social media is changing the actual structure of our cortexes. So I think that the medium actually does affect emotional reactions and emotional formation. There's also the question of how the media report what's happening in the Middle East. And again, the legacy media tend to adopt a more emotionally neutral tone. They tend to be a little bit more even-handed. But the question is how many people in the world are reading those kinds of legacy media as opposed to more hyperbolic and sort of emotionally triggering media sources. I'm afraid that a lot of people are getting their information from media sources that are deliberately provocative because it gets hits. So yeah, I think that the media really does make a big difference.
Shoham was asking throughout the talk, you refer to some emotions as more or less rational than others. Do you think this is an appropriate way to assess how emotions work in political and social life?
Well, rational might not be the right word. The right word might be what's the word? Not motile. Meliorable, changeable, flexible. That might be a better word because, again, it's the difference between anger and hatred. If someone's angry, you're going to have a much easier time calming them down than if they're hateful. So maybe rational isn't the right word, but let's just say, meliorable, something where there's a possibility of engaging that person in conversation. And I think that's actually a really important distinction that I'm trying myself in my engagement with people over this crisis, is to make that distinction between anger and hatred. If somebody's really hateful, I'm not going to get anywhere with them. But if someone's angry and I acknowledge that anger and I, validate that anger, then we might actually get somewhere. So maybe that's a better way to put it. So thank you. That was probably Chizki, but whoever it was a great comment.
I'm just going to jump in with a question of my own because I think it ties nicely with what you just said, which is how do you distinguish between anger and hatred? The line is often blurred. So as you look at your sources, especially when you look at historical sources that are, one thing is today you have the oral and the textual component, but if you're looking at a book or a pamphlet that was printed 100 years ago, the oral component is missing. So that emotional access to either anger or hatred is missing. So what's your technique? What's your methodology to sift what's angry and what's hateful?
A lot of it has to do with individuals versus groups. So anger, frankly, if anger is expressed at I'm going to make this very important distinction. If anger is directed against a group, there's something fundamentally problematic about it. If anger is directed against a state, it's quite rational. Let me explain. The state of Israel exists. It is not an anti-Semitic fantasy to say that the state of Israel exists. The state of Israel has an army, and the army goes into West Bank villages, and the Air Force drops bombs and so forth. Okay, so these things really happen. So if someone's angry at something that really exists, like an individual or a state, because this state did these things or this person did these things, you might be able to have a conversation. But if this person hates an amorphous group, the Jews, right? The Black people, the this, the that, then that's probably not anger, is it? It's hatred. And that's very different. So again, you have to really think hard, even when someone, and it's problematic because when you're dealing with someone who's angry and they speak to you in an angry way, there's a natural fear threat reaction. You turn off, you get defensive, and the problem is how to listen to someone who's angry and ask yourself, are they talking about something real, like what the state of Israel really does, or are they indulging in some kind of fantasy? And it's hard to make those distinctions on the spot. When you're reading a book, then you can have time to sort of think this through, which is why it's so hard to have these conversations with real life people, because you have to make these judgments on the spur of the moment.
The next question is from Idan Liav. It only came to me saying, thank you for your talk. He's a sixth-year PhD candidate in the history department, and he's writing about kibbutz Buchenwald under Professor Herzog's supervision. So it would like to ask, what role do you believe Israel's self-proclaimed exceptionalism has in driving hate? Is referring specifically to the idea that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, for example, that Israel is a villa in the jungle, or other quotes of leadership exceptional Israel. And
yeah, I actually, let's imagine that Ehud Barak had never said that. He'd never said villa in the jungle, which, by the way, if you look at the context in which he said it, he was actually speaking ironically, trying to convince a bunch of Jewish Hadassah ladies in St. Louis to support, and American Jewry in general, to support his peace initiatives. So, but that's, leave that aside, is that people should actually look at the context and actually read the speech where he gave that. Those kinds of remarks in and of themselves become sound bites, but nothing more. I did the most moral army in the world. Okay, I'm sure the American army, other armies proclaimed themselves to be moral. There was a lot of hand-wringing about American military wrongdoing in Iraq. But if you read the right-wing media, there was also a lot of anger at people for calling out, Abu Ghraib and so forth. So I don't think that claims of exceptionalism, these kind of rhetorical strategies, are what get people angry with Israel. I think what gets people angry with Israel is a combination of what it does, and then all of these deeper forces that I talked about at the very beginning, of which anti-Semitism is one component, but only one component. There are other reasons, and they're very powerful, right? When you combine Christian feeling, Muslim feeling, guilt, sympathy, all these really powerful feelings, they're what drive these responses to Israel, not a soundbite from a prime minister. Other questions?
Yes, the next question comes from Tony Kamins. I'm probably butchering this last name. Maybe come in. Saying, I understand Palestinian anger. What I don't get is why it's directed to Israel and not to the Arab government.
Hey, I'm afraid that you're Francesca. Maybe someone else will have to ask questions because you keep breaking up and I can't hear you. You're freezing.
Am I breaking?
Yeah, you're freezing.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you for a couple of seconds and then it breaks up. So I think the question was,
so sorry.
Why aren't they more angry at the Arabs? Something very interesting happened years ago. I was talking to a colleague at SOAS who had recently retired from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And I asked him that same question. And he said, because this was during like 2014, 15, the failure of the Arab Spring, the oppressive, horrifically oppressive response of Arab militaries to the political movements. And he said that in the Arab world and among Arab academics whom he works with, there is tremendous frustration, disappointment, melancholy, sadness, and anger against the Arab states. But they hate Israel. See the difference? There's tremendous anger in the Arab world, or among Palestinians. There's tremendous anger against the Arab world. Vast. I'd say the person who asked the question should read the Arab media, and they would find this out. I mean, the Palestinian media is full of anger at the Arab world. I mean, they're furious with the Gulf states for having normalized, those states that normalized relations with Israel. They're furious with Saudi Arabia for contemplating normalization. They feel abandoned by the Arab world. So they're very angry. But Israel, for them, has a special quality for the reasons I've talked about. But I think a lot of times people who make these sorts of claims, you should just read Arab media, and you'll maybe get a somewhat different perspective. I do. Okay, well, if you do, then you'll see how angry they are. They're so. Anyway, yeah.
I hope that I can be heard. If not, I will ask somebody to read the questions for me.
Oh. No, you've frozen up again.
But the next question comes from Spencer. I'm frozen up again.
No, just talk fast.
Okay. So, Phil Kaisman, would you mind jumping in and reading from me?
Sure. Who am I reading?
The question of Spencer Sunshine. Thank you.
Okay.
Spencer Sunshine.
Yeah, Spencer Sunshine asks, who is it that claims that, quote, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic? No organization I have ever heard of says that. What is criticized as anti-Semitic is any call to dissolve Israel as a Jewish state, including through BDS's endorsement of a right of return, something your ADL example even showed. Please give examples. Yeah, that seems to be the question.
Yeah, it's true that there's a rhetorical strategy that you see a lot in mainstream Jewish organizations that, of course, criticism of Israel is acceptable. But, and then comes the but. Now, let's say you're Jewish. I'm going to give you a few different examples. First of all, you're a Satmar Hasid, and you believe that the state of Israel is a desecration. Are you an anti-Semite? Number one. Number two, you're a kind of lefty Jewish person. You are well aware of the Holocaust. You're well aware of the sufferings of the Jewish people. You admire the courage and initiative of people who founded the state of Israel, but you think that creating a Jewish state in the heart of the Arab Middle East, in the beginning of the era of decolonization, was probably not the best thing for the Jewish people. Okay, you're a good Jewish person. You love the Jewish people, but you think the creation of the Jewish state wasn't a great idea. Are you an anti-Semite? Is that person an anti-Semite? Let's say you are an Israeli Orthodox Jew. You serve in the army, and you belong to an organization, an initiative in Israel that is called One Land for Two Peoples, or One Homeland for All. And you're trying to think of a way to replace the current government of the state of Israel with a confederation. Are you an anti-Semite? You want to change the regime of the state of Israel. You want to change it. And you want to, right? Are you an anti-Semite? See, in all three cases, I would say these people are not anti-Semites. But they are in a profound way, they are anti-Zionists. Now, are there anti-Zionists who are anti-Semites? Of course there are. I mean, I don't want anyone to come away from this talk somehow saying I'm denying that there are anti-Zionists who are anti-Semites. Of course there are. I'm trying to leave room so that the people who are truly constructive, who are truly trying to think outside of the box, can be allowed to do so without being removed from the Jewish body politic, without being prohibited from speaking at Hillel, which is what happens in the United States. That Hillel will not allow a speaker who denies Israel's existence in its current form as a Jewish and democratic state. What if you have a different idea? You don't want to hurt a hair on anyone's head. Are you an anti-Semite? So we have to allow room for different kinds of speech about Israel. That's what I'm getting at. It's not denying that the connection can exist between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I mean, I don't know how many times, I feel like sometimes when I talk about this, people only hear one half of the sentence. Anyway.
All right. I've been delegated. So I'm reading from Sandra Kessler here. Derek seems to give a pass to the, quote, eruption of rage on the part of Hamas, which assumes that they'd been holding it in all this time. Yet the fact that Hamas has been planning this for a very long time The fact is that Hamas has been planning this for a very long time. They work with Iran, along with Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, and the majority of the Gazans voted for Hamas to govern them when Hamas's intentions towards Israel were clear from the beginning.
Okay, well, there's a lot.
If you could respond to that, I suppose.
A lot there to unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, when Palestinians voted for Hamas, 18 years ago, at that time, they were voting largely based on social issues because Hamas was much more effective in providing their social needs than Fatah was. Fatah was corrupt and incompetent. Now, I have read very different things about what Palestinians think of Hamas for reasons that I don't understand. Hamas allows public opinion polling. And I just saw yesterday in Foreign Affairs a major survey of Palestinian public opinion, including Hamas, was published, or including Gaza was published. And I suggest you read this story in Foreign Affairs. You'll be probably surprised. I mean, what you'll find is that a minority of Gazans. I think this was done just like it was published on October 6th. A minority of Gazans support the Hamas government. A majority oppose it. They oppose it on many grounds: economic performance. They oppose its positions towards Israel and so on. I would just say, read the article. Okay, Foreign Affairs this month. So, okay, now you're absolutely right, though, that Hamas planned this attack years ago. And I believe that the people who planned it have an apocalyptic mentality because they knew perfectly well that this attack would lead to a massive Israeli response. But they believed it would bring about a kind of a Götterdämmerung, a kind of an apocalyptic entry of the Arab world on behalf of the Palestinians that would lead to the liberation of the Palestinian people. I think they're wrong. I do not believe that's going to happen. But no, these people have an apocalyptic and I believe hateful mentality. On the other hand, when the attack actually happened, of course there was rage. I mean, there's no way to you all know what happened. This was not the act of a disciplined army. This was the act of people who are absolutely overcome by rage. This is not excusing them. Okay, I'm not excusing what they did. I'm saying they were just overcome by I can't even call it animalistic rage because animals only kill really to protect themselves and for food. This was much worse than that. So the fact that it had been planned in advance doesn't change the actual emotional state of the people at the moments when they were performing it. Is the word I'm looking for sadistic? There is a very strong element of sadism, I think, in a movement like a liberation movement, a terrorist movement, because they want the oppressed to suffer. They want the oppressed to suffer, and then they get to say, "See," and they get to be on top, right? Anyway, I'll limit my psychological observations to that.
Another question comes in from Joan Friedman, who's wondering if you could apply this framework of anger as opposed to hatred to what we are seeing on so many campuses. Why have white United States students come to be not just angry, but I think hateful towards Israel?
See, for that, you'd actually have to talk to the students. And because I teach in a university and I talk to students every day, I prefer to use them as my base as opposed to what I read in the newspapers, because everybody in the world is writing about Harvard now. Journalists come to Harvard, they spend a day here, they talk to a few faculty, they talk to a few students, and they leave, and then they write up their story. I'm encountering such a welter of views on the part of the students. I am encountering students with extreme political views who really believe that Israel is a source of, the source of instability and oppression in the Middle East. Why do they believe this? A lot of it really has nothing to do with Israel. A lot of it has to do with American politics. And this is something going back to 2016. We are in a moment in the United States where the political culture is changing so much and where there is so much anger against, say, the kind of forces of Trumpism and the forces that he enabled. that Israel becomes associated with really the worst aspects of the United States. So these are people who often don't know anything about Israel, but they project their feelings about the United States onto Israel. So are they correct? I mean, are they well informed? Some of these students aren't. Some of them aren't. However, there's a lot of students right now at Harvard who, are particularly graduate students who are from the region who are pretty well informed, and they are hateful for the reasons I've talked about. They and their families and their whole lives have been personally affected, by this 75-year-old plus conflict. So it varies. And again, I would just urge everyone, maybe a lot of academics here already know this, I'm preaching to the converted, but to not trust some, newspaper article written by somebody who spends 5 hours at a university and then writes a story about it. There's lots of bad stuff going on at Harvard right now. But it's a hell of a lot more complicated than the media are making it out to be. And I have been inspired, if we're moving towards the end, I want to say something inspiring. I have been inspired by the views of most of my students, or most of the students I talk to. They are not extremists. They are seeking answers. They're curious. They're concerned. And that's what I'm encountering 80% of the time. It's very inspiring. So just let's try to find some good news as well.
If we can do one more question.
Yeah.
So Hannah Kober is wondering if you can map your taxonomy onto the notion of Hasbara in this moment. She's specifically interested in how Israeli expats in North America are responding to the contemporary toxic public discourse around Zionism and the ongoing war.
There's a problem with Hasbara, which is that in order for Hasbara to work, the intended target has to be somehow potentially sympathetic. And the Hasbara also, if you're trying to reach, for example, American university students at places like Harvard, it has to be awfully intelligent. And what I've encountered among Hasbara is usually not terribly intelligent. The first thing that Hasbara has to deal with is to, again, acknowledge the humanity of the Palestinians, acknowledge their suffering, acknowledge that a great many of those people in Gaza are innocent. If you start with that, then people, again, it opens up a conversation, the possibility for a conversation. Why is Israel doing what it's doing? Again, if the people are overwhelmed by hatred and simplistic doctrines, you're never going to get through to them. But as I've said, there are people who you can reach through a validation of at least their feelings of anger. But pure Hasbara, like the most moral army in the world, or Israel always follows international law, this is prima facie untrue. And Harvard students and students at Oberlin and students at UCLA are very intelligent, which leads to another comment about Hasbara: respect the intelligence of your interlocutor. The students are pretty smart, and they're very media savvy. Not all of them, but an awful lot of them. And that's, just respect the dignity and the intelligence of who you're talking to. That's another very important precondition.
I think Francesca indicated over the chat that she wanted to conclude herself if her internet cooperated, but she just left the meeting. So I suppose with that we can conclude. If Derek, if you want to add a last word, I think that would be great.
Very glad that everybody came, and I appreciate your questions. And it's not as if anybody has a definitive answer to these questions. We just have to make sure to be open to even ask the questions. And what frightens me so much about what's happening, I was just on the phone this morning with a very close friend in Israel who sees everything around him closing down. I mean, right now, people are, they're so obviously terrified, and they're in the middle of a war. And I guess in that sense, it's understandable. But we have to try to avoid closing down our minds, because that's when, I think, Raphael Medoff, you asked, what's some of the bad stuff going on at Harvard? what's going on at Harvard is where you have cases where students are unwilling to learn, unwilling to consider a position other than their own. I do not mean by bad stuff that students are like in horrible danger. That's not what's going on here. But what is going on is that students are depriving themselves of the very reason why they're in university, which is to learn. And then people ask me, well, am I willing to change my mind? The answer is yes. I change my mind a lot. And it's not easy. So I'm just saying that's what I mean by bad stuff. And I think people are really getting carried away by the reportage of what's happening at the universities. What's happening, again, it's not good, but it's not good for the reason, it's not good, but not for the reasons that I think a lot of the newspapers are reporting. It's not good because it's anti-intellectual. It opposes the existence of the university. It opposes the raison d'être of the university. Maybe that's it.
I'm going to jump in. We have to bring the meeting to a close. And I wanted to ask a final question, just to circle back to a point that you raised at the beginning of your talk. You were talking about these strong emotions, such as love and hatred, as a effective manifestation of proximity. Right? We hate people that are close to us. And so I wonder how the notion of proximity can be applied to the situation. And this is something that you also do mention in your book, in your chapter on hating Zionism. And so can we circle back to that question, and does it apply? Is proximity, Jews and Palestinians, is that a question of proximity that creates this hatred? And how do we explain the fact that we're now thousands of miles away from Israel and Gaza, and people are feeling these strong emotions of hatred? What kind of proximity are we talking about here?
Well, that's the point, is that proximity can be imagined, and it can be imagined so effectively that any physical distance really becomes immaterial. I mean, obviously for Israeli Jews and for Palestinians, they've been living cheek by jowl for decades and decades. And there's a very complicated relationship between them. There obviously is the history of positive feelings and positive relationships. There's always been the power differential. And yet, I think that's particularly at this moment, there's no proximity whatsoever. I mean, no psychological proximity. Or if there is proximity, it's the proximity of a blood feud. All right. As far as what's happening on the campuses, this is actually the key question, which is why it is that a conflict 8,000 kilometers from, let's say, New York City, is generating this much emotion, which gets back to what I said earlier. I mean, there are many reasons why young people are so much more incensed by this conflict than by anything else. A lot of it, I mean, I've said, it has to do with American politics. It has to do with the sort of zeitgeist of the United States in the early 21st century. It has a lot to do with the collapse of the old New Left. It has a lot to do with the collapse of the old millennial progressive Jewish left and its replacement by the Generation Z new progressive left, which is a lot of people of color, a lot of people from different backgrounds. It's much more diverse. And these people really feel that their time has come. And Israel to them symbolizes, the older world. That's why Bernie Sanders has been, he's been defending Israel, right? But they're ignoring him. Bernie is like so 2016, right? So it's hard also for us. I mean, I'm probably one of the older people on the call, but even for people who are in their 40s and 50s to appreciate just how huge a break there is now in the American far left for the 20-somethings and how furious they are with the Biden administration. I've heard this a lot from my even, fairly moderate students who think that the Biden administration's made a terrible mistake and they're not going to vote for him in 2024. And I say to them, what are you going to do? Vote for Cornel West or, Jill Stein or stay home and then Trump will become president, So there's these reasons, they all combine. And, at the end of the day, you can say it's because people don't like Jews. Years ago, I wrote an essay that you may or may not agree with, but I argued that if somehow Israel had become a Christian state taken over by Protestant Christians, in the 1920s, and they established an evangelical Christian state, it would be hated at least as much as the Jewish state of Israel is today, and probably even more so, because you'd have non-Muslims occupying Muslim land and occupying, you'd have the same dynamic. So yes, of course, anti-Semitism is a factor, but I think it's psychologically and intellectually very important to get to anti-Semitism at the end, after you've figured out all the other reasons. And then you figure out, okay, how do we respond to these different factors in turn? But you're absolutely right. I mean, people are so worked up about this on the campuses in the United States, although not a single, the worst since Vietnam, although not a single American soldier is fighting. And I'm sorry, people say it's because of the Biden administration's support for Israel. I'm convinced that if the Biden administration turned off the tap tomorrow, you think these people would stop demonstrating? Of course they wouldn't. So this is not about U.S. support for Israel. This is about lots of other things.
Thank you so much, Derek. This was an enlightening 90 minutes. I think we can all come away with it with a lot of food for thought. I want to thank you all for being a great audience, for thought-provoking, in some cases provocative questions. I want to thank Dr. Phil Kaisman for jumping in and asking some of them. And again, Professor Penslar, thank you so much. Just a reminder, the book is out now with Rutgers University Press. There's a code in the chat for 30% off. Go and buy the book. Thanks again. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much.